Hi there, students. Gauge. A gauge. To gauge. Okay, firstly, a gauge is a measuring device. Something to measure the dimensions, the capacity, the pressure. So on your car, you could have a petrol gauge. You could have a pressure gauge. You could have a temperature gauge. Okay, so it's something that tells you information about the size, the dimensions, the capacity of something. A gauge can also be a size when there are various standard sizes. So, for example, you could have a 12 gauge shotgun. 12 gauge talks about the size of the lead balls inside it. A gauge often as well is used to talk about the particular distance between the wheels on an axle. Okay, so there are different gauges. They can be further apart or closer together. And also we use it with the distance between the rails on a railway. Okay, there are different gauges. The gauge of British railways was not always the same as that on the continent. Gauge also, with this idea of size, can be used to talk about the fineness of knitting. A jersey, you take a piece of wool and you knit it. If the gauge is very fine, there are a lot of small stitches, that's the word I was looking for. You have the gauge, the number of stitches per square inch or whatever. And that's a gauge. Now we can use the verb to gauge, meaning to measure. So the petrol gauge gauges the amount of petrol in your car. The pressure gauge gauges the pressure. But we very often use this word to gauge metaphorically, meaning to evaluate, to sum up, to work out, to feel out. So I needed to gauge the amount of interest there was in the project. So I asked several people what they thought about it. An exam is a good way to gauge the level of ability of the students. They carried out inspections on the metal bridge to gauge the amount of corrosion that had taken place. So, to gauge, to judge, to estimate. It's hard to gauge his reactions because he always has a poker face. Yeah? So, it's to determine the level of something. So, what about origin? Well, this word comes from Old French. I think it comes from Frankish and other meanings. There's an old northern French word, jauge, or jauge, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which was a standard measure. So the next question, how formal is gauge? I think this is probably a neutral word. Certainly a gauge is a technical word and you could use it in any formality. I want to gauge the sentiment. I would say this is neutral, maybe ever so slightly formal. You could definitely use it in an informal conversation. You might use to judge, to estimate, yeah? But you could use to gauge as well. In a semi-formal or very formal framework, this is a great word to use as well. And notice as well, to gauge is a regular verb. He gauged the level of interest. Yeah? He has gauged how people feel about this. So a gauge, a measuring device, a petrol gauge, to work out, to find out, to evaluate, to estimate. So they did an opinion poll to gauge the level of support for the different political parties before the election. There you go. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Gauge.